Hi, Nathan. It's really great to meet you. Thank you so much for your time today. We're here to talk about your new book, When Nothing Feels Real, Journey into the Mystery Illness of Depersonalization. It's really good to have some time with you because partly, as your headlines, as your subhead suggests, the mystery illness of depersonalization, there's not masses of kind of mainstream understanding, far from it, about this condition. So it would be great to know, in as much as you're comfortable, about the onset of the condition for you and what that experience has been like.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I appreciate the chance to talk. You're absolutely right. It's not as well known as it should be. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book was both to understand my own illness and come to terms with it, but also to share it with people who share the experience of it with people who might not be as familiar with it as other mental illnesses. So, in terms of the onset for me, I was 28 years old. It was the middle of winter in London. I was living there. I was working and also studying. I was in my first year of a doctoral degree, and I was in this brand new relationship with a completely enchanting person called Maria. And in this kind of the fit, I should say, of spontaneity and enthusiasm, we decided to go for this swim. And we were living in North London at the time, and so we jumped on our bikes off to the heath. And it was during that swim that something happened to me, which I now see is a part of my life as a before and after. And the onset of it really happened during that swim, whereby I felt like I was struck by something, something from outside of me, something that caused me to kind of split in two in a way. The self that I understood as whole, or it was a part of it was confined in some way. And that might sound a little abstract or philosophical, but what that actually meant in real time was that I lost my sense of identity, my immediate surroundings, like the tangible sense that I had of being with this person and the natural surroundings, the environment, all of that was kind of immediately called into question. I didn't know if any of this was real and and the reality of my place within it. And so basically what happened after that is my life completely began to unravel very quickly. And my relationship ended very quickly, and then I had no real sense of what was wrong with me. The symptoms that I had were only exacerbated, and yeah, the days after the onset that I just described were, I guess, the darkest and the lowest of point of my life. Uh, so that was the onset.
Yeah, that must have been terrifying, honestly.
Yeah, completely. Especially because it came out of the blue, completely, and it was like this romance, this romantic moment that turned into a nightmare,
Mhm.
and there wasn't any immediate understanding of why this had happened, or any kind of build up to it. I
Mhm.
mean, I was very stressed at the time. I now have obviously I've had a lot of time to reflect on that moment, and it's so funny because it's this kind of the pinprick that broke my kind of universe in a way. And so I've been over it countless times, obviously on my own immediately afterwards, but also many years in therapy and treatment about like, so that whole moment, it's been picked over so many times by to to try and work out what was it about that particular moment. But uh yeah, it's afterwards it was terrible.
Yeah, I can imagine. Um, so I mean, you're an academic, you're a writer, and you talk in the book about your mind previously being your most loyal interlocutor. I mean, what was it like specifically having that relationship? change so aggressively?
Yeah, it's so interesting because the conception that I had of like my character or the person that I was definitely like an indoor person. I was, I was interested, I was a bookish person. I'd grown up reading. I was fascinated by ideas. I loved talking about them, reading about them. I was very interested in art and the the kind of concepts that were employed within kind of art practice and its production. And I mean, another way of saying that is that the life of the mind was much more important, central, and something that I leaned on much more than like physical prowess, for example. I mean, I was no gymnast, put it that way. And so when I was struck with this illness and the mode of thinking became destabilized in the way that it did, then uh, it really, yeah, it shook me completely because uh, previously where I would draw on ideas as a way of understanding the world, like, oh, I think I know why this is happening, or I think I understand the context of this. But when it's a kind of mystery illness, or when there is basically you don't have a diagnosis, then there is so much uncertainty, so much kind of abstraction, and the brain is. We might talk about like particular brain functions later, but at the time I didn't know why I was destabilized in the sense that I was. And I mean, one of the chief symptoms, at least after the onset, was this feeling of that I was living outside my body. And so the way that that worked was the kind of my perception of the world was as though I was looking down on myself,
Mhm.
performing actions rather than being the kind of master of the actions myself, if that makes sense. So I kind of felt stripped of a particular kind of agency. Um, and so it's when we talk about like the mind previously being a loyal interlocutor, when that is displaced, then I mean everything that I felt made me strong
Mhm.
is is kind of removed or called into question, or at the very least, like extremely diluted. And so it's definitely uh, challenged everything that I had kind of built myself around, or that I had grown, I felt like that myself had grown to be.
Yeah. And I mean, the research you cite in the book suggests that it can take 8 to 12 years to get a diagnosis, an accurate diagnosis of depersonalization.
Hmm.
It's not a new condition. That's another point you make in the book. And then, I mean, why is misdiagnosis so common with this condition? And what was your own route to getting an accurate diagnosis?
Yeah, I'd like to think that the first thing that I'd like to say is that I like to think that that stat is changing.
Yeah.
Uh, 8 to 12 years, that stat comes from particularly through experience that patients have had with the NHS. So that might be different for it, like in clinics in the US, Europe, and Australia, for example. But the 8 to 12 years, and it's probably worth saying that we have the most data that comes through the NHS too, because a lot of the chief researchers are British and have come through that. So that's a really good thing. I think that the reason why it that stat is that it is like that it took 8 to 12 years, that it takes 8 to 12 years, uh, is that at the point of like at the coalface of like the first GP visit when a patient might front up. I talk a lot about this in the book, but it is particularly about the language that is used. So, I mean, I've just described to you my onset, and when when a patient describes feeling like you're living outside your body, or that some part of yourself is removed and you're split in two, these are very abstract and uh, difficult to pin down in terms of locating where that might be happening in the body or even in the mind. And so misdiagnosis via depression or anxiety related depression is the most common thing for people who don't have a diagnosis yet. They have the symptoms, but they're trying to describe the symptoms to the GP, and it gets caught in the net of the broad categories of depression and anxiety. My own experience was that I was misdiagnosed with anxiety related depression. And then initially, I was prescribed medication, like so many people are. But it became apparent to me not only because the medication wasn't working, but there was not even a little sense that the symptoms were being alleviated in any way. And I had this real kind of intuitive sense that there was something else. There was kind of more to this. And I think it's and one of the reasons for that is that when you are set on a treatment plan and that treatment plan is not working, then it becomes fairly obvious that you need to seek further advice so eventually what happened, it took me 3.5 years. So much shorter time than that kind of 8 to 12. However, I had to travel to Australia where my parents live in Sydney to actually see a specialist who could diagnose me properly and the irony of that, Alice, and the kind of personal tragedy of that really for me is that the most specialized clinic and the most experienced uh, uh, people doctors and clinicians who perform treatment were actually like only a few tube stops away at the time. So the Maudsley Clinic in South London is a specialist depersonalization clinic, which still exists today. And it was set up by an incredibly innovative doctor in the 90s called Dr. Anthony David. And he pioneered a lot of the uh, studies and treatment. And but because of the way the NHS functioned at the time that I presented to the GP, there was no knowledge of that I was suffering from this, and so I was not referred to Dr. David and that kind of thing. I only came to find out about this clinic later when I was properly diagnosed and I could became part of a depersonalization community, and I realized that actually in the UK, in London itself, there was this place that could have helped me. So it took me 3.5 years, and I got my diagnosis here in Australia and began treatment here.
Do we know about the causes of depersonalization? What's the latest understanding on that?
Uh, there are three broad categories. It's like genetics, acute stress, and drugs, and those are three big categories. And I have only later, as I've kind of gotten older, I've begun to appreciate the genetic aspect of it. For a long time, I just thought it was this confluence of life factors, family background, childhood, and then like romantic relationships, which was part of my onset. And but they never really seemed like dramatic enough or big enough, like a kind of capital T trauma to kind of invoke what happened to me or yeah. So um but I find it fascinating in the research that I did that drugs are a really big part of the kind of stats that make up a lot of people who have depersonalization in a severe way. And it's not the drugs that you would think either. There's a lot of research about marijuana use, particularly with adolescents. And as I came to understand, it's because the kind of cannabinoid receptors in the adolescent brain aren't as developed as in the adult brain. And so if somehow your biology is susceptible or not as robust in some way, then that toxicity can become more of a kind of permanent and unpleasant high and then result in a kind of severe and years long episodes of depersonalization. And if anyone is interested, there is a really good Guardian article which actually came out in about 2015 by someone who's part of the depersonalization community in the UK, and her name is Jane Charlton, and I write about her, or I mention her late in the book as well, because she was also part of a kind of voice to Parliament a few years ago, which was a very big step for the awareness of depersonalization. But she writes about her experience with marijuana, or cannabis, and how a seemingly simple or everyday drug, it's I think culturally we understand it as like something that is widely available for teenagers. You've got to try it once. And particularly because it's legalized in so many of the American states now, and it's legal in Canada and various other places. Uh, and there are very good reasons, I think. There's arguments on both sides, but for why that should be legalized. Um, but in terms of depersonalization, I don't think there is little to very little awareness of how single use can lead to depersonalization in someone who is genetically vulnerable. Um, Other drugs like ketamine, for example, I mean, when people talk about like going down a K-hole and things, I've never, I have no experience with these because for me, it's my own worst nightmare because ketamine is as much as I understand it, it it mimics the exact symptoms of depersonalization. Like it's a dissociative drug, and so uh, it's certainly not for me. But in the literature, that's one of the drugs where if you are biologically vulnerable, it can result in a kind of semi-permanent state where you kind of get stuck. Uh, and then people suffer these kind of fluctuating depersonalization symptoms, they can do for years. So those are the three categories. And then, I mean, the other one probably worth mentioning is the second one, which was like acute stress, which is obviously a huge, broad category. And in my case, I was stressed because of my study, the relationship, these kinds of things. But I also didn't appreciate at the time that there were also accumulative stresses from childhood or my own adolescence. And so if a person, for example, has a traumatic childhood where they suffer a form of abuse, or um, there are instances of rape, for example. Again, some of these cases I write about in the book, then even if in the moment there is not a kind of onset, the onset might come later.
Mhm.
And it might not always be the result of those particular instances, but something else difficult might come along in a person's life. And it's kind of the confluence of those different things coming together. Uh, so
Mhm.
I think that's the best that I can sum it up in terms of where we're at the minute.
Mhm.
Uh,
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned various aspects of modern life that might be contributing to increased symptoms of depersonalization of various kind of levels of severity. Things like increased time online, virtual reality. And what does the research suggest on this? And what are your concerns?
I think this is a really fascinating and changing in real time uh, threat in terms of I think this is why depersonalization at the moment I feel like it's a very kind of, it's urgent in the sense that the rapid moving kind of virtual reality technology is it's something that in the research that I did, there's a number of different researchers who are doing amazing work on how time spent online and in particularly with like virtual reality headsets, and particularly in a lot of young people, where often you'll spend so many hours online, and as the kind of simulated worlds become ever more immersive, and then the balance between the time that one spends in life doing everyday tasks or, at school, when that balance becomes an imbalance and you're spending much more time in this kind of simulated world, then it is not entirely surprising that one begins to question reality or things that seem everyday, like tangible objects, like moving around in your home. You begin to question whether they are real. So there's a interesting researcher in Canada who has uh, done a number of studies on people's use of very popular online video games, very, very immersive ones, and the episodes of both transient and moderate depersonalization symptoms that result from that. And so, obviously, with the whole conversation that we're having in the culture at the moment about AI and its effects on the workplace and everything. And so, one of the things that is impressed upon me by that conversation is just how fast it is moving. And so, the research in terms of the the Canadian studies will only become ever more uh, relevant, I think, as virtual reality meshes with AI. And I mean, it's very, very interesting. But in terms of where we're at, like at the coalface, at like the cutting edge of the rise in cases of depersonalization and its severity and its kind of lack of awareness among like a younger generation, and that's a big piece of it. It's a big part of it, and that worries me quite a lot. Uh, because I don't think that the tech companies have any, I mean, I don't trust them to embed any kinds of uh, safety mechanisms. I mean, I don't know. I mean, as a writer, someone who just has a book out, I mean, there's obviously uh, huge lawsuits going on at the moment about how OpenAI was trained on, huge data sets of contemporary literature, and so there's yeah. I think where at the moment marijuana and its use among adolescents has been a documented key problem. I think like combine that with virtual reality headsets that are ever more real, then it's a bad recipe.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as I understand it from your experience, you would consider it to be a chronic condition. Is that fair?
Yes,
Yeah. And
yes.
I'd love to know how do you manage it best? Like what's been helpful for you in terms of support and treatment and yeah.
Yeah. The treatment that's best helped me is a combination of two treatments. Initially, m- and initially medication and CBT was that was part of my earlier kind of misdiagnosis, and I've kept some of the tools through that kind of the trial of trying to find my way. I've kept some things as part of like a toolkit that have helped me, but two forms of therapy which have like horrible acronyms have really helped me. So like ERP, or exposure response prevention, and RTMS is another one. And ERP first is where it's often used in combination or specifically to treat people with obsessive compulsive disorder, patients who have a particular fear of contamination or different phobias. And because of the onset that I described, that because that was part of a swim and and obviously it was obviously immersed in water, then what happened to me is that I developed this fear of water. And that because that was almost even the sight of it, and it could really exacerbate symptoms. And so this ERP treatment um, was a way of having small parts of my skin immersed in water for timed periods so that I could become accustomed to this element that I had this great fear and had this horrible trigger of in the past. And if a person, if say for in another, an example of another patient, if they have a fear of germs, for example, or they have a fear of particular like of dirt, or even people have like a fear of excrement, then what the treatment might be is there'll be like a kind of handkerchief, and then there'll be a small part of that contained within it. And then the patient will fold that up and carry that piece around with them for certain times a day for timed periods to get them accustomed to dealing with the fact that this element is present on them and that yeah. And so then when that happens during those timed periods, you note down how you're feeling and the on different scales, and there's different modes in which like the homework that you do are employed. But and the other treatment is something that I think really a lot more people should know about, which is an RTMS, which is repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. And basically what that means is it's just basically using magnets. So if the acronym is too obfuscatory for people, then it's basically where a doctor and a technician are able to locate parts of the brain that are seen as abnormal or dysfunctioning, and they'll be able to animate them and refuel them in a way, kind of wake them up so that in the hope that they will begin functioning normally again, or at what we might call normative levels. Uh, and it's basically where you sit in a chair and you wear a headset and the parts of the brain are located, and then there are these very low kind of magnetic pulses, and it's a slower treatment. It's not like a you take a pill and everything's fixed, but I think that for me over time that is what has diluted the symptoms quite a lot. So those are how I those are two of the key elements. But for every one, it will be different, but those are the two that have helped me.
Okay. Interesting. And I mean, what do we know about the neuroscience of depersonalization then in terms of that treatment? What are they working on?
So again, I want to preface this by saying that I'm not a neuroscientist, but three areas of the brain, the amygdala, the insula, and the prefrontal cortex are kind of at work with depersonalization. The amygdala and the insula are underactive, while the prefrontal cortex is overactive. And so the result of that is a kind of emotional numbing, reduced pain perception, and this feeling that you're living outside your body, this kind of dissociative sense that you have when you look at your hands and they don't feel like they're your own. You don't recognize parts of your own body as your own. Uh, so there are those three elements that are at play. Um, and it's interesting because we previously have talked or briefly mentioned like offline about Mary Phillips's research, and I think that that is kind of important in terms of answering your question too, which is she came up with this great term in like a study and that her team published called "Thinking Without Feeling." I think this the title of the whole study is "Depersonalization Disorder: Thinking Without Feeling." And it was a study that came out in 2001, and a number of the cohort with depersonalization were shown like abject images. Some were, recalling this off the top of my head, were like bullet wounds, like and like I think there was like a dead rat and like a war zone, like things that were images that a kind of a kind of person without depersonalization might find disgusting or gross, or they might recoil from, and they might have an emotional reaction. And so what Phillips and her team did was to measure how the activity in the brain changed when a person with depersonalization was shown these images as opposed to someone without. And what was found was that there was a lack of stimuli and emotional numbness in parts of the brain. And so that kind of mapped on, there was, yeah, they were able to, you're able to recognize, you're able to, in a way, think about this disgusting thing, but the illness itself prevented from you feeling that in a way that a person without the illness would. So I found that a very interesting study. I mean, it's obviously some time ago now, almost 25 years, but yeah, very interesting research in terms of looking at the neuroscience and trying to map the brain. And the way that they did it was with an fMRI machine. So essentially imaging, and we're able to spot things, to locate things.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. So it sounds like it's as much about bringing the feeling level up as anything else. It's about rebalancing.
Yeah, I think rebalancing is a good way. I mean, I often think in terms of like metaphors and things, or like images. And so I think about it in terms of like currents. I mean, because I'm not a medical practitioner or a neuroscience, the way I think about my own brain and the kind of the way that it works when it is kind of like acutely abnormal, let's say, is as if there's these different currents that are kind of flowing into some kind of river, and they're all flowing at different speeds. And so therefore there's this kind of upheaval. And I think that it is about balancing out those kind of currents as they kind of feed in together as a kind of network of currents of the brain, or something like that. And so I think that that's what treatments like RTMS do best when they work for a patient. Um, Tend to rebalance the kind of overall circuitry, or at least that's the aim. Yeah.
Okay. And you talk as well in the book about the difference between acceptance and surrender. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about that because it feels relevant to not just to people with depersonalization, but for anyone dealing with a chronic condition.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, you must be aware through, the well-being, the organization, and so many other different people like in this kind of mental health space. I mean, people talk about acceptance so much. And so through my long courses of treatment, I kept hearing and trying these kind of modes of, I guess it kind of probably falls within the like CBT category, but it's become so kind of bastardized in a way as a word. It's but I think that there are serious treatments that do work for people in terms of acceptance. Um, but I think there's levels of acceptance, radical acceptance, like I mean, acutely radical acceptance or real radical acceptance, and there's all these different. But I guess for me, Alice, I could not relate or to any of that, and it did not help me at all. Um, and I don't know why exactly, but language has been such a barrier for me to getting the right treatment. And so language remains incredibly important to me in terms of the way that I think about uh, my treatment and how the best that will help me in my life to function better. And so for me, acceptance was never really acceptance. It was surrender. And which is a word that I much preferred and has helped me a lot more. And I think the reason for that is because it was exactly the opposite from what I wanted to do. We talk a lot about like fight or flight, like in a panic attack, for example. And I didn't want to surrender. I wanted to fight. I wanted to beat this illness. I wanted to, stay alive, not give in to these horrible symptoms, this horrible thing that had kind of overtaken me. Uh, and yet, for me to accept my illness, I needed to surrender to it. So in a way, the portal to my acceptance was surrender, if that makes sense. And yeah, one of the things that really helped me in terms of like surrendering is that when you feel as though you're living outside your body or that you are looking down on yourself, performing actions as though they are somebody else, then the last thing that you want to do is float. You don't want to be any more outside. You want to kind of uh, feel like you're whole again. And so for me to surrender, I felt like I needed to accept that I would kind of float in a way, that I would dissociate. And so I used to spell the word like float, like just really simply as though a child was learning the alphabet, like FLOAT. And that really helped me just surrender, almost like rising up to meet where I was, kind of outside. And in a way, in a strange kind of counterintuitive way, that would make me more whole because I could surrender to that part of me which I felt was confined. Or again, for anyone not has no experience of this, we are talking in very abstract terms. But so I think it's important for people to understand that this is my own personal like treatment and language, and acceptance and radical acceptance, and these things might be helpful for others. But I think in a way, facing what was the greatest barrier for me and the thing that I was most resisting, which was surrender, that was the way through. Um, and yeah, it's it's not at all a simple process.
No. And it is abstract, and yeah, I feel I understand in some level. And for me, it's that, if we're fighting to find acceptance, what surfaces often is anger and grief and rage and all those complicated things. There's something different about surrender. I can understand how that would change the process.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, try and accept something, but you're really trying. I
Mm.
mean, surely it only invites more tension. And like, why isn't this working? And you're trying to smash against something. Uh, yeah, so much kind of, I think, impatience and urgency is involved in trying to accept.
Mhm.
Whereas often, I mean, especially in my case of depersonalization, uh, you have to be nothing but patient, especially when so long looking for a diagnosis. And uh, so
Yeah.
yeah, surrender is meaningful to me.
Thank you. And last one from me. I mean, if there was a simple way of summing it up, there probably isn't. But what do you wish people knew about depersonalization, and how do you think the medical system could better support patients?
I think I wish people knew how common it is.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, in the UK, about 1.2 million people suffer from it, according to the latest stats. So that's about 1 in 50. Um, and so it's about 2% of the population, which is about the same as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, which is so much more well known. And there's so many better treatment options and awareness. And I think the thing that would honestly most help is for better training for junior doctors and the medical establishment. But I think that that can maybe only happen with kind of greater awareness. I mean, I mentioned earlier that a few years ago there had been patient testimonies read out in the UK Parliament about Jane Charlton was one of the constituents, which was presented by the MP. And I think in official bodies like Parliament, where things are tabled and discussed according to the the kind of reports of someone in a local community, I think that is incredibly meaningful and important. I mean, the NHS has a lot of challenges, but as was my own experience, there is an incredible and long-standing, long-running clinic in South London that has helped people and will help many more people with depersonalization. But the problem is access. The problem is with GPs at the coalface when people who don't know what they have, it just gets caught within, like, as I said earlier, depression and anxiety. And there's just a kind of, oh, here, take these pills, like take this SSRI, this SNRI, and like those catch-all treatments are so frustrating to me. And one of the things that personally want to see is, I mean, it's like we need to understand, I think, that when we talk about mental health, it's even though we've done so well in embedding an awareness of depression and anxiety, that is not at all that is not the whole picture. That and often nowadays I feel like it creates so many more problems. It's as though, oh, because we can have a mental health day at work, it's because, oh, now my dad talks to me about his depression, like as if we've kind of solved it, as if there was no other illnesses within like mental health or mental illness. And I guess I get particularly exercised about this because I personally suffered quite a lot from being misdiagnosed. And so I'm very attuned to trying to have better language, not for the patient, but for the doctors themselves. Uh, and so that's what I wish, and that's my hope, and that's my goal. And these other challenges that we spoke about to do with virtual reality, and I mean those are such big issues. But I think that to tackle those things, we need to do better at the kind of clinical coalface first.
Okay, Nathan, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and to hear your insights on this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Alice. Appreciate it.
Take care.